Hello comrades, it's the Finnish Bolshevik. This time in Marxist political economy, we're going to talk about the birth of capitalist production inside feudalism. First, let's talk about the role of merchant capital. In feudalism, commodity production gradually developed. Town handicrafts expanded and peasant economy was more and more drawn into exchange. If you haven't seen the previous episode, I recommend you watch it because in that one I talked about how the peasant subsistence farmers and also the manorial estates or the manorial economies were basically mostly self-sufficient and they did not engage in commodity exchange. But as production improved, craftsmen could produce so many products that they needed to go out and seek more customers, and also the peasants started to have a bigger surplus and they wanted to get their hands on better tools which they could get from the craftsmen, etc., etc. Eventually you get more division of labor, which means that different private producers start to be reliant on each other and they need to exchange. And that is when you get simple commodity production. Simple commodity production basically means that there are small independent producers who own their own private means of production and they use those to produce commodities which they sell. That's not the same as capitalist commodity production, which is usually called generalized commodity production, because in capitalism, obviously the capitalists exploit workers, whereas at this point in simple commodity production, the producers are not exploited and they don't exploit anybody else. They just produce independently as a private small producer. There were a number of things in feudalism which hindered the development of commodity production. Things such as the feudal lords establishing their own dues and tolls and things like that. They exacted tribute from anybody who wanted to pass through their lands, which created obstacles to the development of trade. But when both handicraft and agricultural production improved, this inevitably led to increased social division of labor between the towns and the countryside, so there started to be more of a pressure to eliminate these hindrances. And in the previous episode I talked about how in feudalism there really weren't proper nation states. Instead, every country was kind of divided into these feudal fiefdoms and territories of private feudal lords and vassals. It was only with the formation of a national market, a domestic market, that the economic precondition for the formation of centralized states emerged. And it was obviously predominantly the bourgeoisie in the towns who wanted to remove all these feudal obstacles to trade and who wanted to create a unified centralized state and a unified domestic market. Obviously, the formation of a world market also stimulated the growth of trade. In the second half of the 15th century, the Turks seized Constantinople, and as a result, they cut off a very important trade route. So people went out looking for other trade routes. Columbus obviously went to America in 1492, and Vasco da Gama discovered a sea route to India in 1498. With the rise of world trade and a world market, simple handicrafts were no longer in a position to satisfy the demand for goods, and this hastened the transition from small-scale artisan production to large-scale capitalist production based on the exploitation of wage workers. There's basically two ways that the feudal mode of production became capitalist. These both happened at the same time. So firstly, the small producers started to fall into two different categories, exploiters and exploited. So obviously some producers were successful, they became rich, while others were unsuccessful and they became poorer. This could happen because of competition, but it could also happen, for instance, in the following way. So in the guilds, there were obviously apprentices and journeymen and masters, and the guild masters, they started to try to prevent anybody else from becoming a master, and they started to exploit people who were under them, while the people under them, the journeymen and the apprentices, they become exploited workers. And the other way is that merchant capital, in the form of merchants, they start to subordinate production to themselves. So merchants, they don't produce anything, but they basically subordinate the small producer so that the small producer becomes reliant on the merchant. The small producer doesn't sell to anybody else. Maybe he doesn't have the time or the knowledge or just doesn't have the means. He can't leave his stuff and go to the market to sell things. So he needs the merchant. So the merchant is like, okay, well, I'll take all your stuff, thank you, and here's some money for you, and now I'm gonna go and resell it. but obviously the merchant is going to be exploiting the producer. He's going to be paying a very small amount to the producer and then selling the goods at a much higher price. The producers could also become impoverished so that they needed loans or basically payment in advance or something from the merchant. Maybe the merchant was also the person who was providing raw materials to the producer. And at that point, you are truly screwed. If the merchant is selling you raw materials, which are probably, at exorbitant prices, and then they are buying your product at a low price, then you're not really even an independent producer anymore. So let's say the merchant sells you string, and then you turn that into cloth, and then he takes the cloth and sells it. You are nominally an independent producer, but you are entirely reliant on the merchant who takes, obviously, the lion's share of the profit. At that point, you are almost an employee of the merchant. And eventually, a merchant, he could be doing this to a number of producers. So he could have like 10 producers that he provides raw materials to and gets finished goods from. And then the merchant figures out, hey, what if I put all these guys into one workshop working together? They'd be more effective that way. It would be also easier because they would be all in one place. And then the merchant figures out, okay, well, this guy, he's good at this part of the process, and this other guy, he's good at this other part of the process. So then he starts doing division of labor, like, okay, well, you do the first part, and then he does the second part of the product. And these kinds of workshops, they are called manufactories. The first manufactories appeared in the 14th and 15th centuries in Florence and in some medieval city republics of Italy. Then in the 16th to 18th centuries, manufactories in various branches of production, cloth, linen, silk, watchmaking, arms, and glass, spread in all European countries. In Russia, manufactories began to arise in the 17th century, and at the beginning of the 18th century under Peter I, they began to develop at faster rates. Now let's talk about capitalist primitive accumulation. There's two things that are required for capitalism to happen, okay? One, you need a bunch of people who don't have any means of production or other property, so they can't feed themselves, and as a result, they need to get employment from somewhere. And then you need another group of people who have a bunch of wealth so that they can become employers. The development and basically the decline and slow collapse of feudalism, which was happening inevitably and automatically and organically all the time, that obviously was creating those two groups. So some people were becoming impoverished and they were becoming workers, while other people were becoming exploiters, and people were falling into these two categories. But that process was very slow, and the rising bourgeoisie, well, they didn't really want to wait. So this textbook, it mentions this idyllic capitalist myth that there were just some people who were hardworking, and then there were some other people who were lazy, and then the hard workers became rich, and the lazy bums became impoverished. But that's not really how things happened. The merchants, the rising bourgeoisie, or the landlords who were becoming more bourgeois by being more involved in the money economy and commodity exchange, they basically just started to purposefully ruin the poor people and steal their property. The case of England is probably one of the most well-known with the Enclosure Acts. So from the end of the 15th century, there took place in England an agonizing process of the forcible expulsion of the peasants from the land. The increased demand for wool from the large cloth manufactories, which arose first in Flanders and then in England itself, gave the direct impetus to this. The landlords began to raise large flocks of sheep, because there was the demand for all this wool. For this, they needed pastures. So what do? Well, you kick out all the peasants and you take the land. If the peasants don't agree to go, well, then you have to use armed force. And the state began creating these laws on the enclosure of these lands, meaning that these lands are private now, you can't come here, and they were called the Enclosure Acts. During primitive times and also during feudalism, the farmlands used to be owned by first the community and then the village, and there were also lakes and forests which were used by the peasants in common. Nobody exactly owned them, but with these Enclosure Acts, all those were basically privatized. So if you try to fish or you try to hunt in these places now, which used to be public land, well, now you are poaching and it's a crime. You're not allowed to do that. If you try to get firewood from the forest, well, that's not allowed anymore. The state is gonna come kick your ass. So all these peasants, they just become ruined and they become beggars and they flock to the cities, begging for alms, basically. And under the feudal laws, you were not allowed to be just a wandering vagabond. So it says in the book that, quote, "Thus in the reign of the English king Henry VIII in the 16th century, 72,000 people were executed for vagabondage," unquote. In Russia, capitalist development happened later, so serfdom was only abolished in 1861 as a result of peasant uprisings. However, the so-called emancipation of the serfs wasn't really all that emancipatory, because in the process the landlords just seized the vast majority of public lands, pastures, ponds, roads, fields, etc. But anyway, as a result of this process, one group of people, the rich guys, they get all this land, and then, even more importantly, this other group, the guys who used to be poor peasants or even serfs, they are now completely propertyless and completely jobless. So they are now good material to become workers who the capitalists can employ. So that's where the proletariat comes from. Well, how about the capital? Where do you get the capital? Money is not always capital, but capital starts out as money. So in the Middle Ages, money was of course accumulated by merchants and bankers. The process of capital accumulation was also facilitated and speeded up by the conquest of America and the conquest of new colonies and the slave trade as well, which obviously involved the enslavement and even extermination of practically whole populations. And as a result of all these things like the Enclosure Acts, driving the masses off the lands, enslavement and extermination of colonial peoples and native populations, as a result of those, Marx wrote that, quote, "Capital comes into the world dripping from head to foot from every pore with blood and dirt," unquote. I've actually seen some reactionaries try to claim that the colonies at some point were not profitable or that they were not a net profit, that maintaining the colonial regimes would have cost more than the profits of the colonial exploitation and colonial theft. In some cases that might be true, in most cases probably not, but in any case it totally misses the point. People try to argue these things because they don't want to accept that capitalism was created largely by colonialism and things like colonial slavery. Capitalism was created by those things because the colonies were an important way of gathering the starting capital for capitalism. The other important source of starting capital was the ruining of the peasants and villages through the Enclosure Acts and things like that. So the point is not to claim that the colonies were always very profitable or that they produced more commodities or more value than the industrial imperialist countries later on. Obviously, once you already have capitalism, and when you have the Industrial Revolution, well, obviously then the industrialized countries produce more. But how do you get there? The point is that the colonies were important for getting capitalism started. So to argue about whether the colonies cost more money than they actually produced is missing the point. The colonies kickstarted capitalism, and thus they've been an investment which has paid off amazingly. The usefulness of colonies for capitalism is not limited only to the raw materials, products, gold, etc., but in the fact that they provided the capital or the money which could then be invested into capitalism, and that capitalism has then provided huge profits. So all profits of capitalism are in one sense profits of colonialism because that's where they came from. Of course, the access to those cheap colonial raw materials would continue to be useful for capitalism, not only during the Industrial Revolution, but also even in the era of modern imperialism in the 1900s and the 2000s. But feudalism didn't only fall because of these things. Those are the economic prerequisites for capitalism, but feudalism still had to be toppled, and it was toppled by two kinds of things: peasant uprisings and bourgeois revolutions. There were peasant struggles and peasant uprisings against landlords throughout the entire period of feudalism, but they became sharper and sharper and escalated towards the end of feudalism. And those of you who have read Lenin, you probably remember where he says that revolutionary situations are where the masses no longer can nor want to live in the old way, and also the rulers no longer can rule in the old way. So the consciousness and the struggle of the masses intensified, but also at the same time, the power of the feudal aristocracy and the feudal rulers diminished, so they could no longer remain in power in the same way. Some examples. In the 14th century in France, there was the Jacquerie Peasant War. At the end of the 14th century in England, there was a peasant revolt headed by Wat Tyler. At the beginning of the 16th century in Germany, there was the peasant war supported by the town poor, led by Thomas Münzer. In Russia, there were the peasant wars headed by Stepan Razin in the 17th century and Pugachev in the 18th century. Those are just some of the more significant ones. In Finland, there was the Cudgel War. In Hungary, there was the peasant war led by Dosa. The rising of the Taiping in China in the middle of the 19th century, which involved millions of peasants. Most times, the ruling exploiting class was able to use deceit and lies to trick the peasantry who were rebelling because they were just too naive and not conscious enough. Still, all these peasant risings, they shook the very foundations of feudalism. On the other hand, there were also bourgeois revolutions, and these were how feudalism transitioned to capitalism. The struggle of the peasants against the landlords was used by the rising bourgeoisie in order to hasten the downfall of feudalism, to replace serf exploitation by capitalist exploitation. The peasants formed the basic mass of those fighting against feudalism in the bourgeois revolutions as well. So it was in the first bourgeois revolution, in the Netherlands in the 16th century, and also in the English Revolution of the 17th century, and in the bourgeois revolution of France at the end of the 18th century. So, the peasantry did most of the fighting, but the bourgeoisie was able to take the leadership and take power as a result. During the bourgeois revolutions of the 17th and 18th centuries, the working class was still too weak, too few in numbers, too unorganized and not conscious enough, so they couldn't take the leading role in these revolutions. Now I would say that we've dealt with the most important stuff, but just because this is interesting, let's talk about the economic views of the feudal period. During feudalism, the ruling ideology was religion. There was basically a mental and spiritual dictatorship of the clergy. Mental life in feudal society found expression predominantly in a religious and scholastic form that includes also economic theories, so economic theories also found expression in the form of theological texts. In China, economic views in feudalism for many centuries were under the influence of the teachings of Confucius. Confucianism as a religious ideology had arisen already in the 5th century BC. The social and economic views of Confucianism required strict maintenance of the hierarchy of feudal estates, both in state and in family life. In the words of Confucius, quote, "The unenlightened people should obey the aristocrats and wise men. Disobedience by ordinary people to their superiors is the beginning of disorder," unquote. Confucianism was the ideology of the ruling class, but the peasants also put their own aspirations and hopes in the form of Confucian preachings, because it was the dominant ideology, it was the only way that they could understand the world. And Confucianism eventually became the official ideology of the nobility. In medieval Europe, one of the main ideologists of feudalism was Thomas Aquinas from the 13th century, who attempted to justify the need for feudal society by basically appealing to God. He was an Aristotelian of sorts, so he tried to appeal to reason, so he claimed that feudal property is necessary and reasonable. Thomas Aquinas also, similarly to the Platonists, actually in medieval Europe, the official ideology was scholasticism, which is kind of a mix of Platonism and Aristotelianism. So Thomas Aquinas and all these other scholastics, they considered that physical labor is somehow lowly and inferior, whereas mental labor is noble. In this division, Thomas Aquinas saw the justification for society's division into estates. There was a strict feudal hierarchy, and each person should own wealth in keeping with the position which he occupies in the hierarchy. And obviously they claimed that this is all ordained by God and it's inherent in the very fabric of God's creation. The class struggle of the oppressed and exploited masses against the ruling classes of feudal society also took on religious form for several centuries. So the demands of exploited peasants and journeymen and other exploited peoples were frequently based on Bible quotes and things like that. There were all kinds of heretical sects which the church fiercely persecuted through the Inquisition, and these heretics were burnt at the stake. What were the heretics? Well, the heretics, they obviously had religious beliefs that were different from the official line, but a lot of the time it had to do with being more egalitarian, resisting the horrible exploitation perpetrated by the church and the other landlords. And naturally the church then slandered all the heretics. They said that they must be worshipping the devil or something. Utopian socialism, the first kind of socialism, was actually born towards the end of the feudal period. There were two outstanding early utopian socialists, the Englishman Thomas More, who wrote a work called Utopia in the 16th century, and the Italian Tommaso Campanella, who wrote a work called The City of the Sun in the 17th century. They saw all the horrible misery and exploitation that was going on, and they wanted to imagine what would be a better world, what would be the ideal society without any of these evils, and that's what they wrote about. In these books, the utopians describe a social system which is free from private property and all its accompanying faults. The works of More and Campanella played a progressive part in the process of the development of social thought. They contained ideas which were considerably in advance of the development of society at that time. More and Campanella did not know the laws of social development, and that's why their ideas were unrealizable, or, so to say, utopian. It was impossible at that time to destroy exploitation and social inequality. The productive forces simply were not there. It was not possible to carry out a proletarian revolution, etc., etc. They did not have a scientific theory of economics, etc. But still, that was the beginning of socialism, so its importance cannot be overstated. Classical political economy also emerged during this period. In the 16th to 18th centuries, there emerged the first trend of economic thought that tried to understand capitalism, and that trend was called Mercantilism. The Mercantilists discussed the question of the country's wealth, the forms of wealth, and the ways of its growth. At that time, the predominant form of capital was merchant and bank capital, not productive capital, and that was also the time period when they had discovered and conquered America, where they found all these precious metals. So the mercantilists were very interested in precious metals and precious metal circulation or money circulation. And they thought that that's where wealth actually comes from, which was obviously false, but again, at the time, they probably couldn't do any better, and that was still the start of scientific economics. The mercantilist economists reflected the interests of the growing bourgeoisie, which was striving to accumulate wealth in gold and silver by developing foreign trade, colonial plunder and trade wars, and the enslavement of other peoples. They wanted to defend the home industry against foreign competition by imposing tariffs and duties, and that policy was called protectionism. That is characteristic of the very early period of capitalism. The revolutionary democratic trend in Russia was started by A.N. Radishev, 1749 to 1802, who was an economist himself. He resolutely attacked serfdom and defended the oppressed peasantry, and argued that those who work the land should own it. Radishev was firmly convinced that the autocracy and serfdom could be liquidated only by revolutionary means. In the first half of the 19th century, there were the Decembrists, who were revolutionaries of that historical period in Russia when the need to replace feudalism by capitalism had ripened, and they considered the abolition of serfdom and the emancipation of the peasants as the most important condition for the development of Russia. They were revolutionaries coming from the ranks of the gentry or small nobility, and they carried out a failed military coup. They tried to overthrow the Tsar, but even though it failed, and even though they came from the ranks of the small nobility or gentry, it was still a progressive movement that helped the growth of the revolutionary movement in Russia. At the time, the outlook of the bourgeoisie struggling for power had a progressive character in a number of countries. Its most notable representatives, economists and philosophers, subjected to decisive criticism all the fundamental principles of feudal society: economic, political, religious, philosophical, and moral. They played a great part in the ideological preparation of the bourgeois revolution and exerted a progressive influence on the development of science and art.